All of these topics really mesh together in various ways. This is an interface of phylogenetics and morphometrics, and allowing you to take more of a phylogenetic perspective, which is then an evolutionary perspective on variation. So variation doesn't always exist just randomly. It might exist because of features that are inherited from a common ancestor. So this is a nice study where they took these different clades of related plants, and they were measuring the dimensions of their corolla tubes. So their flowers, are they big at the opening? Are they narrow at the opening? Are they long? Are they stout? And so on. So these are basically like looking at the flowers from the side. These are their general characteristics. And this is very mathematically heavy. So they're taking lots of measurements and put those into a phylogenetic context, accounting for variation, and then you get this kind of graph here where you can quantify, put a number on the variations in shape. So all the way over here in one of the extremes is these shallow, really open flowers, and then over here, long and narrow, very closed up flowers. And those go along with the colors, as you can see, is more of a red zone here for the red clade, going into a orange zone, green. I don't know. It's kind of looking for a pattern. I don't know if the pattern stands out 100% here. Variation in plants that are important to people. This is always helpful to be able to put a number on. So this is a part of an investigation into the millet plant. And there are different versions of this plant that people eat. They cultivate for food. And if you're going to maybe breed yourself the best millet that you can grow, this is a good way to look at that and say, okay, what are the features that we want in our millet plants? Is it lots of seeds? Is it height of the plant? Maybe to make it a better competitor? Is it drought tolerance or something like that? And you can put numbers on these different features and then potentially use those differences to breed these plants together to make a more optimal plant that you want. So this is a nice little career tie-in if you get into agronomy or studying plants that people grow for food. There's a lot of concern with maybe growing the best version that you can get. And that involves numbers and math. All right, so this is from a paper that was highlighting lots of different environmental factors that can cause plants to grow differently. Maybe I'll throw it up here just so you can get it into your notes. Reasons for variation. So variation is simply the topic of differences. And you can have variation that's due to genetics. So basically plants are different and they're programmed to be different. And they're going to become different no matter what. That would be something that's due more to genetics. You also could have variations due to the environment. That would be, say, plants growing differently if they're in the sun versus the shade, if they are in the... You can have variation due to genetics, variation due to the environment. And then, of course, there's a possibility that you have a little bit of both. So this is a whole other field of morphometrics that we're not going to get into, but just sort of good to keep in mind. This slide that I started showing you here has a lot that's due to the environment. So just a nice collection. You don't have to worry about the details here. There's lots of different plant species. This study was picking up information from lots of previous studies and just showing how different features can arise as a result of, as you can see here, differences in the sugar concentration of what they're growing in, or shade versus sun. These are some genetic effects here. So on temperature, yada, yada, etc. So you can actually get in some cases, if you look very finely at a single plant species, you can learn a lot about what exactly causes some differences, some simple differences all the way up to some rather extravagant differences. Here's one for terrestrial plants and submerged plants versus the kinds of leaves that they make and so on. So I mentioned genetics and environment. So we did environment there. Here's a genetics reason. This is something we can do these days. I teach in my genetics class a lot about this. You can basically look at differences and then explore whether there are DNA differences that might be associated with those plant morphological differences. And so they're investigating these different genetic markers as a response, or an element responsible for the differences in height, yield, and so on. This one is a classic experiment, so one really definitely worth talking about for us. As you can see, it goes all the way back to 1948. This is a study, really one of the foundational studies to illustrate that the same plant species can grow differently in different parts of its range. So this is the plant here. It's a species of yarrow, and they had it growing at different environmental locations. And one of the bigger factors that was different in these environmental locations was the elevation. So we have elevation of 4,000 feet down here at the low altitude population, all the way up to 10,000 feet here, different sides of this peak and so on. And they see that there's some variation where these high altitude populations are relatively smaller plants. This is a map, a little chart showing the variation. It's a histogram on its side. The widest part shows where most of the measurements are. So this is the average measurement, one sense of the word, for plants at the high altitude. This is the average measurement there. And so the average of these different measurements goes up higher, taller plants at lower altitude, shorter plants at higher altitude. This is a common feature we see in alpine plants, but they're the same plant species. So another part of this experiment might be to go forward and say, what if I take one of these high altitude plants and grow it at a lower altitude? It can help you to investigate what is causing differences from altitude versus genetics. Here we've got plants growing at different temperatures, nice illustration of the different kinds of leaves that they make at relatively not a giant difference in temperature, but if you can get a reproducible effect like this, this is telling you pretty strongly that you've got something environmentally causing this difference. If you can do it in controlled experimental conditions, you got a pretty good reason for what the differences are caused by. So temperature, light, lots of examples here. We don't have to go into every one of them, but this plant in greater sunlight makes more robust leaves. In lower sunlight makes smaller leaves, so on and so on. So to really put a number to these things, to quantify them, put our word out there, quantify. It's basically to put a number to so we can look at plants and know that they're different, but getting in there on a fine scale and putting a number to how much different they are, how much bigger, how many more parts they have, and so on. Another feature that we'll see, another term we'll see, is quantitative. As an adjective, basically investigation that looks at this number, numeric version of something you want to compare. And if you want to get good evidence for there being a quantitative difference, you often have something like this, a more controlled environment where you can control all the other factors and maybe explore, okay, if they're growing in just about exactly the same conditions, the same size pot, the same soil, the same light availability, the same space between them and their neighbor, and so on and so on. Same temperatures, obviously they're in the same environment, so they'll get a lot of the same environmental exposures. You can still have variation under these scenarios. So you get some plants that are taller or shorter, leaves of different sizes and shapes. And you can measure those and get kind of a baseline for what's just variable as a result of just pure randomness. You always want to take that into account in biology. And then over here, I've got this word clone. So you can actually, in a lot of plant cases, make genetically identical plants by splitting them vegetatively and see if they're all the same. So as I mentioned before, genetics, environment, or both, how can you tell which one is responsible? One of the ways to do this, as I suggested already, is to take plants that are native to different parts of the environment and put them in the same place. So this is a type of experiment that's often called common garden experiment. So if you have plants growing in lots of different environments, and you take them or seeds from these plants and grow them all in the same plot. Shoot my arrows to the wrong spot. If you grow them all in the same place, then you have the situation where they are experiencing the same environment, but they might have different genetics. So you can kind of rule out the contribution from the environment and only expose the differences that are due to genetics. That's the idea here. So you see this kind of experiment sometimes where the plants are in a natural environment. They get natural sunlight, natural rain. They're in natural soils, but they're otherwise quite manipulated, as you can see here. So they're placed in these different bundles of members of different species. And then you would see if all the plants from all the different places are similar to each other or different to each other. Transplant or common garden experiment. This was an interesting study from a little while ago, illustrating that if you've got plants with variation, a lot of times this variation reflects a local adaptation. So we never want to assume that what we see is perfectly adapted to the environment. Sometimes there is just randomness there or genetic elements that can't be overcome. But this experiment was showing that within the same species, these 3 species I have highlighted here, the scientific names are on the pictures, go along with the labels there. Basically, what I've highlighted here, these are features that more commonly associate with their local environment. They're actually adaptive benefits to growing in this way in the place where they came from. If you put them into a different part of the habitat where the same species can grow, but doesn't, the same individual isn't growing there, it'll do less well. So sort of like if you're a city person, you can learn to live in the country, but somebody who already lives in the country probably has an edge. Okay, so going back to that study, actually the same study of these different yarrow plants growing at different elevations. This is an experiment where they took them and put them into these common gardens. And in some cases, they see that they are experiencing better effects in one of the environments or another. So highlighting here in this color, one of the options is that they grow much better in one of these environmental conditions than others. This one's doing very well in the low elevation environment. I don't have on here where it's coming from. Let's say this is coming from a low environment starting point, doing well in the low elevation environment. This one has a little bit of an edge for this medium elevation environment, still doing pretty well in the low elevation environment. And then both of these quite a big drop into the high elevation environment. It's a little more challenging environment being at high altitude. And then this yellow one, kind of a curious pattern where the same individuals, if you split them and grow them at these different elevations, they do among the best at the high elevation. Nobody does great here, but they're about as good as you can get at high elevation, and they don't do any better at the lower elevation. So this case, this flat line here tells us that this is basically a genetically determined outcome, where no matter where you grow this plant, it's going to grow about the same height. So depending on the species, you can have a big effect of the environment, that's this reddish color, or really no effect at all of this yellow color effect of the environment. Sometimes you can see plants growing differently in response to the environment. There's this term here we haven't talked about yet called phenotypic plasticity. Plasticity, I just find that was kind of a strange word to wrap your head around. It's basically something that's able to change. So it's not like we actually use the term plastic, but it's much different from like a structural plastic you might eat your lunch out of. So ability to change in response to changes in the environment. And a lot of times we talk about this in more of an adaptive fashion. So it's not necessarily always making a form of plant that benefits you, but having the ability in your toolbox to change how you grow depending on the environment. So the same species finds itself in sun or shade, it can grow leaves accordingly that are better suited to shade or sun. And this can be due to environmental cues. in response with genetics, or it could just be kind of a resource thing, right? Plants that have more access to light grow in a different way than plants that have less access to light. But this is kind of a common theme. So if you have less light, these leaves are bigger to be able to catch more of that light. A little bit of a trade-off there. All right, so I guess some things to think about here. You might be strongly in tune to your environment, not so much in tune to the environment. And over time, basically a plant, if it can respond best to its environment, over time with whatever that environment deals, it's going to stand a better chance of persisting and reproducing. So sometimes there's a good advantage to having a format that's always stuck in the same way. Sometimes there's an advantage to having a format that changes depending on your environment. So maybe I'll just leave this open for thought. Which one might be more or less advantageous. For example, if you had flowers that changed depending on resource availability, that might impact your ability to get visited by pollinators. So maybe it's valuable to be able to keep making the same kind of flower, no matter how your resources are doing. One form of variation is what we call these cultivated varieties. There's a shorthand term for that. Cultivated variety gets called cultivar. Cultivated variety gets shorthanded to cultivar. Cultivar, this comes up in situations where people are selecting plants. So you might have a person who collects a plant that's different from most individuals of that species. So sometimes you see some rather extravagant kinds of plants that are sold. People can make money on these because they're different from the other ones that people are more familiar with. So we have some different variation in leaf color and variation in this, I should say variegation format. Put that on for a vocab word. Variegation is basically green, white. Green and white streaks in a leaf often shows up as variation. People tend to like these, if you're used to this pure green version, having one with white streaks in it, people like those. So these originate sometimes, a lot of times they just originate naturally through variation, and then people seize on that difference and try to propagate the features that they find interesting, and then you might end up with a kind of plant that you can always grow with that odd feature in it. So you can buy these variegated hosta plants and keep propagating them. They split vegetatively, give them to your friends, and everybody has variegated hosta. The question of whether variation is adaptive, this is a pretty open question, and sometimes you can get in there and investigate it. So this is a study looking at basically the defensive toxins in this plant in the mustard family, shown here, this glucosinolate, and the concentration of the defensive compound depending on which part of the range these plants are growing in. So there's a kind of a big difference on the left-hand side. We've got these orangish circles. Right-hand side, the more eastern side of the range, these more blue circles. And so we have a geographic difference, a broadly speaking geographic difference. And then you could ask yourself the question, okay, well, is this because it's something genetic that they don't really have any control over, I guess in the short term. So you could have just a population of this species that moved into an area and then spread successfully because it had a different concentration of these toxins. Or you could have maybe something different about the environment that's causing these plants to need to have more toxins, where they're required to put that in. You could subdivide this question with further investigation, looking at genetics versus environment, do a common garden experiment, for example. So I mentioned quantitative. Quantitative are things we can basically put a number to. And there's this other kind that's related called qualitative. So go up here to quantitative and contrast that with qualitative. And if you want to think about it, quantitative is like how many, or how big, how much, things like that. Something you can put a number to. Qualitative is based on this word that means more like what kind, or we'll show some examples here. So qualitative, you can call these qualitative features or morphometric features. They're ones that are a little bit more difficult to put a number to. So going back to our illustration here, color is an example of a qualitative trait. So we have names for colors. You say some of these are yellow or orange or red orange or something like that. But it's not a number, and it's sort of a cutoff between these different categories. So at some point you call it red, at some point you call it orange. And if it was a number, you could maybe assign a number in between. You've got differences in the relative abundance of reproductive organs in these different flowers. Present or absence, so different colors here, whether something is present or not. So they're not immediately something you can easily put a number to. Now, you actually can put a number to them. For example, if you have an image of these flowers, you can use a computer to tell you how yellow this is. You can sort of do a color picker and say, okay, tell me what color this is. And there's actually a number version of colors for computers. So you can say what number is yellow, what number is orange, brightness, darkness, redness. You could put numbers on those if you needed to. Quantitative, again, something you can count or measure is usually how we treat these. And going back to the group we were looking at a while ago, the buttercups, genus Ranunculus, here are some examples of some of the features that are quantitative versus qualitative. So I have this green color for our quantitative measurements, sizes of things, so blade length, petal length, numbers, can you count it? Number of achenes in the achene head, a range of these showing the variation among individuals. Here we've got number of lobes in the blades, so 1 lobe or 3 to 5 lobes. So these are all quantitative. You could put a number on these, and if you were writing a key to make a difference, you could say greater than or less than. Those are nice dividing points for these. The other ones are a little harder to put numbers to. These are qualitative. Presence or absence of a feature. So are we hairy on the sepal epidermis or not? Glabrous versus hispid, sometimes a little bit of both, but there's not necessarily really an easy way to say that there's a mix in between, a range in between those values. Shapes, same way, we have these broad shape categories. You can put numbers to these. You could do some kind of measurement of the ratio of the length to the width, but often they're just described as shapes. So where does orbiculate leave off and ovate picks up? Hard to say. Tuberous roots, absent, present. Yeah, so quantitative, qualitative, some examples for you. If you take something that is a numerical measurement, you often get one of these.